There were some rumors going around that he's been recharged, and it sounds like the feds did decide to recharge him because the Ninth Circuit had vacated the Duarte decision.
Right. So the Ninth Circuit, after the dismissal, vacated the Duarte decision. They're going to hear it en banc in September. So I am frankly just shocked by the fact that the government decided to move forward with charges now, just given what's been going on and developing in Second Circuit case law around the country, including in the Ninth Circuit. They recalled the Duarte decision. They depublished it so that the entire Ninth Circuit, the court as a whole, can re-review it. I am not expecting a different decision. And if you look at what decisions are coming down from other circuits around the country, other circuits are in alignment with what the Ninth Circuit found. And I believe that ultimately the Supreme Court will be in alignment when the issue comes before them, probably in the next year or so. But they refiled charges. We will again move for dismissal. There are a couple of other motions that I will be filing in addition to raising the Duarte and Second Amendment challenges. We'll be moving to dismiss on additional grounds in the coming weeks. This is, a case where Mr. Hatch was charged, as you know, initially by the state. We have one dismissal there. Charged then by the feds, second dismissal. And they're going at it again a third time. And one of the things I think that's most shocking about the newer indictments, it all involves identical conduct. So the same conduct that the state charged initially, then the federal government picked up, right? Expanding Mr. Hatch's exposure in terms of what his penalty could potentially look like. Then over a year passes, we get the second dismissal and they file a second charge. Same exact conduct, but there's questions about why, if this was a valid charge, should not have been brought initially the first time. And so we'll be raising motions concerning that charge specifically and the government's motivations for bringing the charge so late after Mr. Hatch has exercised his constitutional rights in this case.
So you said he was turning himself in today in San Diego. Is he going to have to be in custody?
He is not turning himself in today. It's next week. So I think that's where I cut out. The government wanted him to self-surrender today. That makes no sense. He was on bonds in his state case. He had no violations. He showed up to court. He showed up to court on time every time. He was on bond in his federal case. Hatch won for over a year. No violations. He showed up to court every single time. There were no issues whatsoever. Issuance of an arrest warrant in those circumstances, something I personally have never seen. As you know, I was a federal prosecutor for a long time before I started doing defense work. That is not something that I had seen as a prosecutor. It's not something I've seen as a defense attorney. Uncalled for in this situation. We moved to recall the arrest warrant. We moved his appearance date, not a self-surrender date, an appearance date to next week. So next week, August 2nd, Mr. Hatch will appear in court, not surrendering himself as the prosecution wanted him to do. Their request for an arrest warrant in this case, in my opinion, there is no justification for it. He is not a risk. He has shown that he is not a risk. Multiple courts have found that he is not a risk. On this exact same conduct, we are before the same judge as his first federal case. It is completely uncalled for. And I reached out to them before I had to move the court to recall that warrant. I reached out to the prosecutors in this case, and I asked them to do it on their own, given Mr. Hatch's history, to recall it on their own, because typically in cases like this, when a person is not a flight risk, what happens is the prosecution will just ask counsel, me, to notify their client to come into court on a certain date. They refuse to do that. So even after they sought the arrest warrant, which is something I'd never seen before in a case like this, they then refuse to recall it, refuse to set it for a hearing. And that is where we are. And that's the atmosphere that Mr. Hatch is defending himself in.
Wow, that's got to be a little concerning and such a letdown from what happened. I mean, it seemed like we had a discussion last week that there was some thought that they weren't going to refile anything until SCOTUS decided Duarte, which could be like 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is when the case is over, I'll go more in depth on my personal opinions about the DOJ's move in this case with Mr. Hatch and the prosecutor's specific motivations in this case with Mr. Hatch. But when you have a case like this, where there are significant questions about whether Mr. Hatch's conduct as charged is even illegal, significant questions, and you have jurisdictions across the country that have ruled that the law as applied to people like Mr. Hatch is unconstitutional, with the backdrop of the Ninth Circuit having already made that specific finding, and you decide to recharge him now, that makes no sense. The statute of limitations in the federal system is 5 years. What that means is the government has 5 years from the time that Mr. Hatch, is alleged to have engaged in criminal conduct to file criminal charges against him. We are in a state right now where best case scenario for the government, it does not look like this will be a constitutional charge for him moving forward, but there might be some ambiguity. Worst case, it's clear that they're moving forward on a charge that they know is not constitutional as applied to Mr. Hatch. Either scenario, that would be unethical conduct to move forward. They can wait until the litigation concludes in the Ninth Circuit. We're talking about a couple of months. Oral arguments in the Duarte decision and banc oral arguments are set for September. That means we're expecting a decision in the Ninth Circuit by the end of 2024. They refuse to wait until the end of 2024, where we're going to get clear guidance from an en banc entire Ninth Circuit panel on this specific issue as applied to Mr. Hatch. Why they decided to move forward in this manner, you can all make your own assumptions. I certainly have thoughts on that. Why they've decided to do it so aggressively, where they've issued an arrest warrant when Mr. Hatch is not a danger, not a flight risk, has complied with every terms of supervision, both in this federal case and this state case, and why after I reached out to them, they refused to recall the arrest warrant and set it for a hearing date is ridiculous.
And it seems like the judge assigned to this case, just from being in court and seeing the way she's reacted to this, would be completely sympathetic to everything that you just said and not like what the government did. But is she going to feel like legally she can't do anything because they vacated Duarte and she just has to see what the Ninth Circuit is going to do? And she can't dismiss the case right now.
I don't know what the judge is going to do, and I certainly wouldn't presume to know what's going on in her mind regarding the Second Circuit or anything else. I can tell you this, though. Cases across the Ninth Circuit right now are basically on hold where these allegations are charged. On hold. That means the government filed charges knowing that we're going to be in, there's not going to be any movement in the case until Duarte is decided. So their decision to move forward on Mr. Hatch at this time, all that means is that now he's going to have to ask for permission if the judge imposes the same conditions before he travels for work, for example. He's going to have to be subject to other pretrial conditions that everyone else who's charged with a federal case is subject to. It limits his liberties before there's any certainty on whether the charges against him are even constitutional, with the backdrop of multiple courts finding that the charges are unconstitutional. So they are intentionally limiting his liberties early, knowing that so many courts, including the Ninth Circuit previously, has found it unconstitutional as applied to him. That's just ridiculous.
Wow. Well, kind of a unexpected, unfortunate turn of events for you guys, but it sounds like you have a lot of reasons to be optimistic that this is just another temporary charge that you'll be able to ultimately get dismissed.
Right. And as I mentioned, I think the volume may have cut out. We're filing multiple motions to dismiss. I have additional motions to dismiss based on different issues that we'll raise in the coming weeks. I am extremely optimistic that this is going to be dismissed again. That said, I'm also extremely disappointed in the government's decision to move forward timing-wise now, when all it means is that Mr. Hatch's liberties are going to be curtailed. The government is going to have more control over him when they shouldn't, because they decided to charge the case, to refile charges before the Ninth Circuit has made their en banc ruling in Duarte.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no way this case is going to be adjudicated before all that ends, right? So this is kind of for nothing. well.
Yeah, there are additional motions to dismiss I'll file that are not dependent on the Duarte decision. So I think there are other constitutional challenges given the government's conduct in this case that are ripe at this point. I don't know whether the judge would agree with my position and Mr. Hatch's position on those motions, but we're going to give the courts other reasons to dismiss independent of the Duarte decision, and those are going to be motions that will be filed shortly after Mr. Hatch is arraigned next week.
Yeah. And you said the charges are, it's felon in possession of a firearm. That was the previous charge, or unlawful possession of a firearm. You said there was a second charge in the new case. What are the?
There is. So they charged Mr. Hatch with possessing a firearm while being an unlawful user or addict of a controlled substance.
Oh,
I'd like to
Biden charge.
Right. So I just as the backdrop on this, we know that Mr. Hatch was under supervision for over a year, federal supervision. One of the conditions of Mr. Hatch's federal supervision is that he was subject to regular drug testing. There have been 0 violations. They know this. They charged an individual who, for the last year following his original arrest in this case, was regularly tested for narcotics by pretrial services, and at no point during any of those tests did Mr. Hatch test dirty. So for you to be charged with this, you've got to be an addict. An addict means someone who can't control their drug use.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be a user, someone who is actively using while you're possessing the gun. Assuming that charge in itself is even constitutional, and there's significant questions about the constitutionality of that statute anyway. But even if it is constitutional, and even if it is constitutional as applied to Mr. Hatch, look at the facts of the case. And whether the motivation for charging that is legitimate with a guy who we have been monitoring, the government has been monitoring for over a year and knows has not used any narcotic during that period of time.
Yeah. Well, that's got to be, does Duarte affect that charge at all? Was there any thought that Duarte would gut that charge? Because we haven't heard that in relation to the Hunter Biden case. And is that the exact charge he was charged with and convicted of in Delaware?
It was. So Hunter Biden was charged with that same charge. It is one that is very infrequently brought. I've been practicing in federal courts for over 20 years. I've had one case prior to this where that count was alleged, and the count ultimately was dismissed. That's a tough charge to prove generally, even if the statute is constitutional, and even if the statute is constitutional as applied to the specific person. But Hunter Biden's case first was different. This is an individual who had a deep history with substance abuse. He got into treatment. He'd made comments to various people about his inability to kick his drug habit. He was using regularly, including afterwards. And the testimony that we saw in the Hunter Biden case showed his drug use in the days and weeks after he purchased the gun. That is very different than what we have here. What we have here is, in fact, a record that shows that Mr. Hatch was not using narcotics, that he was tested regularly by the federal government. And those tests showed that he was not using narcotics. Those are the facts that we have here. But there are and have been challenges to the constitutionality of the statute on its face in other districts. And other districts have found that statute is unconstitutional both as applied and on its face for a variety of reasons. There's a district court that has found that it's unconstitutional on its face for 2 reasons. First, using the analysis and some of the concurring opinions in Rahimi, they found that the statute does not require some sort of judicial finding that someone is an addict, or a judicial finding that someone is a user of narcotics. And secondly, the statute doesn't have a limitation in terms of time, how long the person is not allowed to possess the gun. Other statutes have addressed it on an as-applied constitutional analysis. There are arguments that the statute is vague. What does it mean to be a user? What does it mean to be an addict? There's no clear definition of either of those. And then, of course, we've got the issues with Mr. Hatch and the fact that he's not a user or an addict. So, and we have a very clear record of that the government has and knew about before they charged the case.
Yeah. Well, Well, what a piece of news. I saw somebody saying that in the comments earlier, that he'd been reindicted. And like I said, I just assumed it was a rumor that wasn't true. But no, it is. You've got some more work on your hands, it sounds like. So August 2nd in arraignment then?
It will be August 2nd. I believe it's 10 or 10:30. I'll shoot over the time though.
And there's some hope moving forward that he's not going to be taken into custody. I mean, there's lots of reasons for this. It sounds like the prosecutors would prefer it, but you'll be able to make an argument that he should stay out.
Yeah, there's no reason to put him in custody right now. We've had numerous findings, and for those of you in the audience that have not followed Mr. Hatch's case from the outset, the government arrested him and put him into custody when they first charged him with his first federal case. The magistrate judge in that case then found that Mr. Hatch was suitable for bond and ordered his release. The government then moved to stay the judge's order. The judge declined to stay the order. So that meant that Mr. Hatch was still going to be released on bond. In response to that, the government then appealed the bond order. They appealed the order to the district court judge. The result of that appeal meant that Mr. Hatch statutorily had to stay in custody for 3 days. And it was over a weekend, so that 3 days actually turned into 5 days. He should not have been in custody those 5 days. In front of the district court also found that Mr. Hatch was not a flight risk, that he was not a danger, and that he was suitable for bond. She thereafter released him on bond. He's been on bond the entire time. There have been 0 violations. He's been performing beautifully, as anyone would expect of him, and he's been doing fine. So there's been no change of circumstance to justify putting him in custody. I don't expect that the judge would. Of course, I am not the judge. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what she is thinking, but there's no part of me that would expect a court to find that Mr. Hatch now is a flight risk given his history of compliance with court orders.
Yeah. Well, okay. What else should we know? Is there anything else you wanted to say before we?
I think that's it. No, if you've got any questions, let me know. I'd be happy to answer them to the extent I can. I'm, again, just very, very disappointed in the government's decision to move forward right now. Yeah,
that's disappointing for everybody involved in that on that side of the case. I can tell. Well, it sounds like we'll have to look forward to next week and see what happens on August 2nd, and I'll check back with you then.
Sounds good. Thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.